Thanks again, everybody, for coming to this edition of Project Spotlight by the .NET Foundation. Today, we're super excited to talk to Shaun Walker, a creator of Oqtane. Shaun, do you want to go ahead and give us a quick intro?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Shaun Walker. I'm a technical director with Cognizant Soft Vision. And I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of an open source project called .NET Nuke, now been rebranded as DNN. But I've been a long time contributor to the open source ecosystem within .NET. And I'm also been involved with the .NET Foundation for many years, since 2014. I'm happy to be on the Project Spotlight.
Yeah, awesome. It's funny because we actually have done Project Spotlight on DNN. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out, folks. So, Oqtane. So, uh, maybe you want to give us just a really high level of what Oqtane is and what value it brings to .NET developers.
Sure. Yeah. So Octane is a modular application framework. Um, and I guess the concept there is that rather than building applications from the ground up in sort of a static way, the idea behind a modular framework is that you basically get a complete foundation of an application to build on top of, and then you focus on building your specific um, business applications as modules, which sort of seamlessly plug into the overall foundation to create a cohesive application. There's a lot of benefits of doing things in a modular way, in that you can, break down the problem into smaller pieces. You can develop them independently from the main application. You can deploy them independently. Um, those are, I guess, are the main advantages. And this approach, has been popular in the software industry for quite some time. And there's a lot of modular frameworks which exist. I guess the main differentiator for Octane is that it's based on the new Microsoft Blazor technology.
Oh, that's awesome. So, let's take a step back and kind of talk about like modular frameworks, right, and why those are valuable for developers, especially .NET developers, right? When you build out applications, you have tons of different components, right? If you are in e-commerce, you might have a shopping cart, you might have a login mechanism, or what have you. And it sounds to me like Octane allows users to kind of build with an existing template or a way that makes it easier to get started. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so like I said, it gives you a sort of a foundation to build on. It's a little different though than you can obviously start applications by building on top of a template, which is a set of starting source code that you can then add your own custom bits to comprise a complete application, or even sometimes it's called a boilerplate, where it gives you some services and things that you can build on top of. Whereas like a modular framework is a bit different in that you're probably not expected to modify that framework at all. It's intended to be a product in its own right, but it provides you with extensibility points, like interfaces that you can connect to with your custom code so that you can add additional functionality. But you don't actually change the source code of the framework itself. Just like building on ASP.NET, right? You typically don't want to modify the source code for ASP.NET. You build on top of it, and that's the idea behind a framework like Octane.
That's great. And so, uh, I want to talk about the way that you built it and the technology that you're using because Blazor is awesome. Can you kind of speak to a little bit about why you decided to build Octane and one of the main reasons why you felt the obligation to say of okay, let's build out a modular framework, um, you know, with the newest technology that's came out recently.
It's interesting because I've built many kind of frameworks over time. .NET Nuke is probably the most well known. But it's funny because why do I like to build frameworks? Probably because I'm lazy, in the sense that I don't like writing the same code over and over and over again. Right? There's some fundamentals that are part of every application that you really shouldn't be writing from scratch every time. And that's where frameworks come in, right? Where they provide some sort of commodity type functionality that typically exists in most applications. And you get that for free out of the box. And then you can focus on building your specific business logic that is trying to solve your business problem. Um, yeah, so I think that was, I guess, the main motivation. I get more specifically for Octane. I had been obviously involved with .NET Nuke for a long time. I created the original version way back in 2002, um, and that solution is obviously still available. It's still a very popular open source project that people are using in enterprise scenarios and building extensions for. Um, However, the technology over time has become a bit dated, and as a result of that, I wanted to create something that was new and based on the kind of the modern application development models, like using single page application architecture, client server, and using front end technologies that are innovative and really pushing the envelope. And that's where I really was attracted to Blazor because it has a really rich component model behind it, much like some of the front end JavaScript frameworks do. But I'm a C sharp developer, and so I feel a lot more comfortable in that environment than I do with JavaScript. So it seemed like the perfect fit.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? And I think that's probably the primary reason for the existence of Blazor, right? Is that being able to write C sharp at all levels is super interesting. So it sounds to me like you just wanted to play around with the newest bits of stuff. So you came up with an idea like, "Oh, I'll build something that's actually involved instead of building a ton of hello world type of applications, right?" Um,
Hmm.
so, I would love to know, yeah, obviously, as you're going through the process, like Blazor just launched at .NET Conf. That was what, a couple of weeks ago in the middle of November for people in the future. It's fairly new, so I imagine you've been following the previews for a long time, right? So
Yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about your experience of kind of? I imagine that you've been building Octane for a while, right? And I'd be interested to know kind
Yeah.
of how you've been, building an actual, I guess you could say, scalable release worthy software when primarily you were building it all on hot bits. I'm kind of curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. That's definitely a bit of a challenge. Yeah, so when I started getting involved with Blazor and started, downloaded the preview bits, this was in October, November of 2018, and so at this point in time, Blazor hadn't even come out of the experimental phase from Microsoft. The ASP.NET team was working on it internally, but it still had an experimental label on it, and so I had, obviously, I had a really good knowledge of what I had, like the concepts that I had used to build DNN. And I thought, you know, Blazor has a lot of dynamic capabilities to it, and it's based on components. So, can I use those concepts to build something in Blazor natively from the ground up that acted similarly to what DNN was capable of? And so, yes, I was able to do that. But along the way, Microsoft was releasing new preview bits every month. And so often my proof of concept application would get broken. And then I had to figure out why it was broken. And luckily, I did have some really good support from members of the team that was working on Blazor, like Steve Sanderson and Dan Roth and others. I mean, they helped me get over a few roadblocks along the way. And then initially Microsoft made the decision that they were going to release Blazor um, for the server side first. And luckily, right from the beginning, with the concept that I'd come up with, I knew I wanted to support multiple hosting models. So it was okay that Microsoft, provided support only for server side at first, because the Octane solution was capable of running on both the server side and the WebAssembly versions. And so um, I kept Octane in beta for quite some time. I didn't actually release the 1.0 version until Microsoft released full support for WebAssembly, and that was in May of 2020. So only like 6 or 7 months ago. And then worked through a number of subsequent versions, just stabilization type releases until I decided that I should probably move forward with the Microsoft release train. And so with .NET 5, a new version of Blazor came out, and I wanted Octane to run on that immediately. And so the community did a bunch of work to make that happen, and we released Octane 2.0 on November 11th. So to coincide with .NET Conf and .NET 5. And the reception's been really positive. So quite happy about that decision.
Yes, I mean that's very impressive, right? So when .NET 5 is officially generally available, Octane is running on .NET 5, running, you said multiple hosting models, so it's doing the WebAssembly bit and the server side bit.
Hmm.
That's super impressive. I mean,
Yeah.
it
Well,
sounds to me. Go ahead.
most of the credit probably belongs to Microsoft for that because the going from a .NET Core 3.1 application to .NET 5 was actually really straightforward. I mean, Microsoft really took care to not have a lot of breaking changes between those. So the transition or the migration path to .NET 5 was actually really straightforward.
That's great. It's great to hear because in the past, obviously, migrating from different versions of frameworks is always a challenge, right? So
Yeah.
it's good to hear that going from 3.1 to 5 is at least for Octane didn't essentially make you have to rewrite from scratch or reconfigure your hosting models and anything like that. So
Yeah, the other cool thing was that if you had built extensions for Octane based on .NET Core 3.1. After Octane was upgraded to .NET 5, those extensions that were compiled on .NET Core 3.1 still worked. But
wow,
there was they without any compatibility issues. So that's also pretty cool, right? So
yeah.
that just means that the underlying bits were fully compatible, and I was quite impressed by that.
It's great to hear. So I'm curious. So obviously, based on what you're talking about with Octane, it seems like there's been a ton of work and a ton of help from the community. So, and I'd imagine because people see, oh, this is a very interesting concept, right? Modular frameworks built on the newest bits that exist, right? What was the initial community? I guess you could say reaction, or like, was there a ton of interest? Was there a oh, okay, this is kind of cool, but not for me. It seems to me, like based on what you're saying, there's been pretty good community engagement and community interest.
Yeah, it's interesting because the concepts that were used in Octane were very similar to what were used in DNN. I initially thought that the community members who had participated in DNN would be, the first adopters. They would be the ones who would see the similarities and if they wanted to experiment with newer technology, that they would give it a try. But that's not what ended up happening. It was actually a completely new community that formed around Octane. Um, it tended to be, I guess, younger developers that were very interested in Blazor technology, developers that, much like me, didn't really like JavaScript that much. So they liked the whole promise of writing C sharp on the front end. And then only more recently, I've seen more of an influx of developers from the DNN community taking a look at Octane. So it is interesting how you have ideas of what might happen in terms of how a community might form and grow, but in reality, it ends up being much different at times.
I mean, community is everything, right? I think if the community adoption is great, like it sounds like it is, like that's only going to feed in more success in the future. So one of the things I'm curious about as well is so what's the future? Like you just dropped 2.0. Obviously now, like I jokingly said, when .NET 5 was released, okay, so where's my .NET 6? So so
Yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
obviously probably doing some planning for the capabilities that are coming with .NET 6.
yeah,
Obviously, initially that hasn't been previews dropped. You can get nightlies if you're a masochist, but um,
yeah. No thanks.
so I'm curious to know, like, now that 2.0 has been dropped and it's got community adoption, like, so what are the next steps?
Yeah, so I'm not even really thinking about .NET 6 at all at this point.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about .NET 6 because Microsoft recently published a few documents that are sort of previews of the themes they would like to tackle in .NET 6, and one of them is cultivating and growing the open source ecosystem around .NET. So that's cool because that's great for Octane as well. But in terms of more of the technical um, roadmap for Octane, um, like you said, so it had a 2.0 release that coincided with .NET 5. But there's like with open source projects, there's almost no limit to the number of features that can be added, and sometimes sometimes the feedback from the community can be like overwhelming, and it's pretty clear where you should be applying your efforts. And sometimes it's random, right? It's all over the place, and people are requesting things that you never even anticipated. Um, with 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 Octane, there have been, I guess, a few categories where people have been making the most requests so far, and one was in the early proof of concepts. I decided that I would initially only support SQL Server and the different sort of derivatives of it. So, SQL Azure, local DB, those types of, but ultimately it's still a SQL Server engine. Um, and there's been a lot of requests for support for other databases like SQLite or MySQL or Postgres or, any number of other platforms. And so I think that that would be the next major feature um, that needs to be focused on, and that would probably be the major feature in Octane 2.1. Um, I guess one of the other major features that was introduced in 2.0 was support for localization, which is really, helps make application development in the global market more possible. Right, developers need to create localized solutions um, that can cater to multiple languages, and so the architectural sort of underpinnings of that were released in 2.0, but the full implementation was not completed. And there's actually one person who is in Yemen who's done an incredible amount of work in that area. And since 2.0 was released, I don't know, he's probably submitted like 30 or 40 pull requests
Oh wow,
already.
that's
So, I
awesome.
mean, yeah, so there's a lot of work going on in that area as well. And then, I mean, there is a long list of additional things that a framework like Octane can provide. But I think one of the other things I've always wanted to focus on in Octane, because it tends to be an area where frameworks get some criticism over time, and that's sort of the inner loop for developers. How easy is it truly for developers to create custom solutions based on a framework? And I know that this is a focus for Microsoft as well, but it has to be a focus in Octane. Unless it's like super easy for developers to get started and be productive. Um, a framework is really not going to be that successful, and so that's got to be an area of focus as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yes, you kind of hinted at a little bit that you've gotten a ton of pull requests, right? So for developers that are interested in either trying out Octane for their own solutions or if they feel like they want to contribute to Octane, like, what is the best way for them to start that?
Clearly, like there, obviously on GitHub there is the main repo, and we have a dev branch and a master branch. Right now, the master is just for bug fixes in case any major issues come up, and we need to quickly be able to issue like a maintenance type of release. But most of the development's going on in dev right now. Um, it's usually a good idea when you get started with open source projects, to clone them, fork them, try to dig into them fairly deeply to really to understand the inner workings. We also have published an Octane philosophy document, which kind of describes the high level concepts which we're trying to exemplify in the project. And that helps people with some sort of guidelines, on where to focus their efforts. A good example is, we try to stay away from too many third party dependencies on other um, projects, just to keep things simple. And so that is to give developers who would like to contribute to Octane, some guidelines, right? Don't try to pull in every dependency you can think of into the
Yeah.
project, because that probably won't be accepted. So it's good to set those expectations up front so that people don't spend a lot of time and effort and then are disappointed. The other thing I find is, which is difficult, to try and curb people's enthusiasm, right? A lot of first time users of Octane will show up, they'll download the source code, they'll take a look, and there'll be certain things maybe that don't follow their coding preferences, and then they'll submit pull requests, right? Those pull requests don't fix any bugs, they don't add any enhancements, they're just that person's personal preference on the way things should have been coded. And I have a difficult time with those types of pull requests, because they're they take a lot of time to review. Sometimes they don't add a lot of value. Sometimes they actually break things because they don't adhere to backward compatibility principles. And but this is, I guess, one of the challenges of being a maintainer of an open source project is you spend a lot of time reviewing things and actually rejecting them and saying no, and then you feel like the bad guy because you know that people
Sure.
put their passion into it. But I mean, you've like any product, right? You have to manage it. You have to keep it moving in the right direction.
Oh, I mean, I've been very vocal about people that like to open pull requests to kind of adhere to what their principles are, right? But I think one of the things that's very interesting as well is you mentioned that you have kind of a guidance, a set of guidance documents, which is very valuable. I'd imagine that you have a good amount of documentation about Octane in general, and if folks want to contribute, but they are kind of nervous about submitting a pull request, the documentation obviously is in open source as well. And taking a look at
Yeah,
that, I imagine you'd probably enjoy mightily somebody coming in and just opening a bunch of pull requests against your docs to fill them out a bit more.
yeah, absolutely. Because actually, that is an area that's pretty weak with Octane right now is the documentation. There is a bunch of work that was done in 2.0 by a community member to set up at least the automated sort of doc effects generation of API documentation based on the source code, which is awesome. So at least that's published. But in terms of more elaborate, articles or filling out, the use cases for using these APIs, that's a weak area. And yeah, it seems like it's really difficult to encourage people to get involved in the documentation area.
Yeah, I think there's a running joke about developers not liking to write documentation or document their code or whatever, right? Like, so I think it's not really it's cliche, but it's very accurate. So I think if there are some folks out there that are more interested in helping out with technical writing or documentation, because maybe they don't see that they can provide any value by adding code because they don't have an idea for a feature or an enhancement. you know
Hmm.
Docs are always growing, and I think one of the things that's super essential is having people that are interested in contributing to making sure that other people can use the software. Because I think
Yep.
one of the things that's probably lacking with a lot of open source projects, to be honest, is people go to the repo, they look at the docs, they find the docs somewhat confusing or not clear, and then they'll just trickle away, right? And I think
Yep.
that's really valuable. So I
Yep.
mean, I think one of the things as well that we should talk about is you mentioned that you have worked with for a while with the .NET Foundation. I would like to kind of know, you know, that a little bit about what your roles on the .NET Foundation and what you feel like the .NET Foundation provides to you as a developer, as to you as a maintainer of a project in the foundation. I know that was a lot of stuff there, but
Yeah.
if you want, yeah, talk about a little bit about the foundation in general.
Yeah. So my current role is I am the chair of the project committee, and I've been acting in that role since February of 2020. Um, and I guess sort of the reason why the project committee was formed is to help projects early in the stages of when they make the application to become a member project, and then help them once they've become an actual project with any advice or guidance that we can provide to them. um, Prior to the project committee being formed, the bulk of the work in terms of onboarding projects was being done by the executive director, and that wasn't a huge amount of work if you consider that in addition to their other activities. And so the one thing that Claire Novotny, who is the executive director now, was keen on when she came aboard was creating committees that were functional, active, and working hard to help fulfill kind of the mission of the foundation. And so one of the first things we did in February is we kind of constructed a charter for the project committee, which said, this is how we should evaluate project applications when they come in. Um, Pretty simple criteria, but I mean, how does it align with the foundation values? And then is it a mature project in the sense, is it active? Does it have a community around it? Is there multiple developers who are contributing to it? Just basic activity kind of things. And we're basing all that on public metrics that we can capture from GitHub. And so we publish that as the charter so that it's pretty clear, this is how we're evaluating things, and the community knows there's not sort of sort of a hidden agenda or secret criteria that's being used behind the scenes. It's all pretty transparent. And then every month we review the project applications as they come in. Um, we review them against the charter. And then for those who are deemed to be, sort of worthy of being part of the foundation based on their maturity and the fact that they adhere to, the eligibility criteria, um, then we pass those on to the board as a recommendation, and it's ultimately up to the board of directors as to whether or not projects are accepted. The project committee doesn't have any authority in its own right, right? We can do is make recommendations and kind of do the legwork to capture the relevant information. And so that's what the project committee is mostly focused on. Um, there's a lot of individual things that come up here and there when it comes to projects. Questions about licensing, questions about trademarks, questions about how to use the infrastructure, questions about the types of services that are offered. But those are very, like, I wouldn't say that there's a general category. That those kind of things come in, they're pretty random, and different things will flare up now and again. And that's also where the project committee gets involved to try and help those projects with whatever issues they're encountering. And so that's mainly where I've been participating in the foundation. But um, that's only been, I guess, in 2020. Prior to that, I was a member of the advisory council. And that advisory council would meet monthly with the executive director to discuss, I guess, matters related to the .NET open source ecosystem and how those relate to the foundation. Um, but the advisory council has actually now been um, dissolved in favor of the committees, because the committees are much more focused on the specific issues.
Yep. No, I can contest to that. I'm a part of the marketing committee. So obviously, the advisory council, that's a lot of freight if you're worried about project onboarding and membership and marketing. It's a lot for, a handful of folks. So separating everything out to marketing allows the different groups to be autonomous and kind of come together and kind of report back to the board about what some of the initiatives that we're trying to accomplish in a way that's a bit more managed. Otherwise, it's just, okay, what does the advisory council have? And it's a huge list of just stuff, right?
Yeah, and it is all volunteers that are doing this work behind the scenes, with limited resources,
Yeah.
I might add. So it's not like the foundation has, a lot of resources at its disposal, right? Time is the most valuable resource, and that's coming from volunteers.
Yeah, and as we're closing out, I just want to obviously, you're a volunteer for some of the work on the .NET Foundation, so thank you for that. Also, you have a project on as a part of the foundation, so thank you for being a part of it. And for folks that they want to know more about Oqtane, like it's all available on GitHub. All the information about Oqtane that you need will be on this project spotlight page. And I think you know I want people to go out and try Oqtane, see if there's see if it can bring value to your development work. And if you have the urge to contribute, I imagine that Shaun will appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was actually pretty excited with .NET Conf. I had the opportunity to actually present at it for the first time, and I did a session on building dynamic applications with Blazor, and of course used Octane as the example of that. And um, yeah, I think that I kind of ran out of time in my session, but I got the bulk of the content covered, so I was pretty happy about that.
Yeah, as somebody who is a speaker at .NET Conf as well, running out of time is always fun. And I watched your particular session and it was great, so people should check that as well. We'll make sure that a link to that gets into the Project Spotlight page too. So that's our edition of Project Spotlight for this round. I want to again thank Shaun for coming on. This was great. Again, try out Octane. It's fun. It's on Blazor. It's the newest bit, so definitely take a look. Shaun, do you have any parting words?
Not really, but I just really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the spotlight. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to serve the .NET Foundation as well.
Awesome. So that's your positive spotlight for this round, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care.